Well, it's wonderful to see such an animated crowd. Very nice to be able to welcome you all to tonight's lecture. My name is Robin Sedikatis, and together with Rahil Yegi, I'm directing the Center for Social Critique, which organizes the annual Benjamin Lectures. It's an immense pleasure to welcome all of you here, to welcome many of you back, since I assume many of you were here yesterday, but I'm sure that there are also some new people in the audience. It's really thrilling to see that so many of you made your way here for the second of this year's lecture.
Yeah, so we really had a wonderful evening yesterday with an exciting and very intense and inspiring first lecture. So actually this is like the highlight of our academic year. I mean, this is what we were working towards, and we are so happy that it turned out, just great. So Sally Haslanger, this year's Benjamin Chair at the Center for Social Critique. We are so lucky to have you here as our guest, Sally. And as many of you will have been here yesterday, today, we are not going to introduce you at length, but just underline once again that Sally Haslanger is one of the most exciting contemporary philosophers whose work on practice and social structure and race and gender, ideology and social transformation has made her into one of the prominent and admired voices in the critical theory tradition. Thanks again for being with us and for these intense weeks that we already had in discussing all those matters.
The overall title of Sally's Benjamin Lectures is Agents of Possibility, the Complexity of Social Change. And in yesterday's opening lecture, Sally gave a characteristically brilliant and thrilling exploration of society as a complex and dynamic system in which social practices play a constitutive role. As she showed, this approach also allows us to identify the leverage points in that system that allow for activism to have transformative effects. Tonight, Sally will continue her exploration of the possibilities of social change under the title, What Can We Do? Co-designing social interventions. I'm sure we are all very excited to see how the plot continues.
For sure. So I'm the one to make some very brief technical announcements now. Again, after the lecture, we will have some time for questions for a Q&A. And just like yesterday, there are two mics to the left and to the right of this auditorium. And please queue behind those mics if you want to ask a question once we start the discussion. Once again, we want to remind you that this lecture is being recorded, but it's just the stage that is recorded, so you don't have to worry about your privacy. Also, switch off your mobile phones again. And then something we forgot to mention beforehand yesterday, there will be some handouts for those who have difficulties reading the presentation. So raise your hand if you want to get a handout, and then you will be provided with one. Okay, that's already going on. Yeah, that was it.
Again, a very warm thanks to everyone who has helped to make this possible. The wonderful team at the center, whose visible and invisible work is a condition of possibility of what we're doing here on the stage. The New Institute Foundation, of course, for its generous support of our work, and the Staatsbibliothek for hosting us in this beautiful public space. But most of all, of course, to you, Sally, for being with us, for sharing your newest work, and for being so generous in your intellectual engagement. Please join us in welcoming back Sally Haslanger.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back and coming for the first time if it's your first time. I had such a blast yesterday. I hope you did too. I hope we can have a blast again today. I'm going to start with a bit of a recap of what we did last time, so people who are new today can get a feel for what we talked about. I apologize. I mentioned to you already that I thank you for listening to me in English. And I apologize yesterday. I was told that there were points when I was talking too fast. And I was excited. I was a little nervous. It was one of those times when it's hard to control your voice from just taking off. And I will do my best today to slow it down a bit. And I have some very kind people who are going to gesture to me if I need to kind of slow it down. So I hope, so blame them, not me, if it goes too fast. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to do the outline again. I'll start with an introduction and a brief recap. And then I'm going to talk about the path dependency of value, and as a consequence, the path dependency of critique. I'm then going to talk about social change and contrast punctuated equilibria with incremental transformation. And I'll get to that and let you know what that is about. And then I'll look at a particular strategy that I'm very wedded to because I've been involved with it for some years, and it's something I do in my teaching. And it's one example of a methodology for social change, and I'm going to introduce you to that and say why I think it's an especially useful methodology, especially in the context of critical theory. And then I'll draw the conclusion and maybe a little taste of what's coming. Okay, so here's our introduction. Most, if not all, societies reproduce profound injustice and harm to many. How does it happen? And how can the process of societal reproduction be effectively disrupted and replaced so that better systems emerge? Now, some of you might remember yesterday I talked about social reproduction. Social reproduction is the term that socialist feminists use for the reproduction of the agents, of social agents who become laborers and such like that. Societal reproduction is the reproduction of the whole thing, right? So, and as a socialist feminist, I want to be able to distinguish those. So we're just talking about broad societal reproduction right now. In the first lecture, I argued that societies are complex systems that reproduce themselves, their culture, their practices, and their structure. However, they are dynamic and constantly evolving. As I mentioned, this is a protein, but it kind of looks like a society if you got way, way back. Oh, not really. I don't know what a society would look like if you got that far back. Anyway, I also argued that social systems are networks of social practices, and that practices are a primary site for intervention to achieve greater justice. And there's the network, also the same one as last time, and that is the skeleton of what's going on in the other one that's a little more complicated. Social practices cannot continue without our participation, so we can have an effect on how the systems evolve. So the practices create these relations. Those relations are those links in the network. And so if we stop participating in those practices, then we change the relations, and then that changes the network, and that can maybe change the system. So today I'll say more about interventions that target local practices to highlight a form of organizing that speaks to the concerns and objectives of critical theory. And here is an example of some of the communities that I work with. So what is a social practice? Again, we're still in the recap mode. Coordination around resources, which I take to be things of either positive or negative value, is a fundamental human task, and our ability to develop flexible forms of coordination that can be passed down through social learning is the key to our evolutionary success. We cannot survive without coordination. It's absolutely essential to humans. And we do develop coordination through social learning. I'm going to get to that. Coordination relies on meaning, symbols, default assumptions, and associations. That is culture, or what I'm going to call a cultural techne, to shape our behavior. And I didn't mention this yesterday, but I've made this word up, this neologism, cultural techne, because just talking about culture can be confusing to people because people use it in so many different ways in the academy and outside of the academy, etc. And I want this notion to pick out a set of tools. That's why the techne part. It's a set of tools that we use in different contexts that we can pick up, and we can be what Levi-Strauss called a bricoleur, which is somewhat like a handyman who can just use different tools in different contexts. So as you know, you can use a screwdriver to open a paint can. You don't always just use it to unscrew screws. And the same is true of us when we are relying on culture. But a lot of the times, we just do it fluently and unconsciously. But the toolbox idea is crucial to the picture. So we not only learn what is edible, but develop cuisines, menus, daily and holiday rituals. So here's a cedar waxwing, beautiful bird. And the cedar waxwing doesn't learn through social learning whether to eat little red round things or not. The cedar waxwing is, so to speak, programmed to eat holly berries and other kinds of berries. If you throw red beads onto the ground, the cedar waxwing will probably go and try to eat them because it didn't learn from the parents what was edible and what was inedible. But we have to learn from our parents which berries are edible and which are not edible. And that we learn through basic socialization, social learning. So on my account, an ideology is a cultural techne gone wrong. It can go wrong in a number of different ways. It obscures or distorts what's valuable and or organizes us in unjust or harmful ways. So the cultural techne, as I talked about last time, it's not a set of beliefs. It's not even in the head. I think a cultural techne is like a semiotic system that is out, like language is public. You learn a language, you can develop fluency in a language, but it doesn't live in your head. It lives in that public space. And the same is true of an ideology. But ideology, because we rely on these tools to get around in the world, it can make us go wrong, right? We can rely on a problematic idea or a problematic logic of how we ought to respond to different situations and end up doing damage to ourselves, to others, and to the environment. Okay, here's the picture. So there we are trying to organize, and the public meanings are the techne, and when they go bad, it's an ideology. Here's the resource, which is a bunny. We can think of it as a pet or as a food or as a pelt or as a wild animal. And we draw on those tools, on those social meanings to interact with the world, to perceive the world, to understand what's available in the world, what counts as valuable or not. And then we act on it. And then this in turn reinforces the social meanings. So to change the social practices, you could change the semiotic and or material conditions. So because these practices, I'm sorry that my pointer's not too bright and they don't want me to use it anyway, so I won't. So we have the practice, which is again, what's going to constitute these relationships, which form the network, which blah, 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 blah. We can actually intervene on the social meanings or intervene on the resources. Okay, this in turn can change the structures and the entrenched systems formed by the practices. And we cannot and should not simply rely on the state to solve our problems, right? Because, the state is not going to be responsible for, generating concepts like pet and pelt, right? We have to do this. So when we talk about gender, we are the ones who are responsible for, okay, do we have how many genders? Do we have gender at all, etc.? That's not something for the state to decide. That's for us to decide. So we can't rely on the state. But then the question is, how are we going to go about social change if it's not going to be asking the state to change the structure? Because on my view, the structure is not a set of laws. It's not the government. It is the framework that we all embody in our everyday lives. That's the structure that we have to change. Okay, so the path dependency of value and critique. When seeking social justice, it's important to keep in mind there are many acceptable ways to organize social life. The goal is not to ask what practices are the best way and critique any that fall short. For example, we need not assume the best way to organize meals is to have a traditional breakfast, lunch, and dinner. 3 square meals a day, that's the way every society ought to do it, because that's the best way. Now that would be silly, right? We all know that. I mean, there are, reasons why that has evolved, but there are cultures where you don't have 3 meals a day for all kinds of reasons, and it's not necessarily the best way. Nevertheless, some ways of producing and distributing food are unhealthy. Some exploit workers, some destroy ecosystems, and some cause suffering and or death to sentient beings. Animals, like cows and chickens and pigs and all sorts of things like that. Okay. So a normative social theory provides tools to identify ways in which our current practices are inadequate so we can do better. But what counts as better is going to depend a lot on the local factors, the geography, the economy, the cultural traditions and history, and human biology. Okay, so there's going to be a broad range of options that we have. I'm going to talk about Jack Balkin in a minute, and he's an American legal scholar, and he says, nobody says that you have to have three, the principles of justice require that you have three parts of the state, the judicial system, the executive, and the legislative. That's one way of doing it, but there are lots of different ways. So there's going to be maybe, some idea of justice that can get implemented in different cultures in different ways. So this is Balkin. I already anticipated him. This is a quote from him. He says, values are not so much what humans have as what they do and feel. Human beings possess an inexhaustible drive to evaluate, to pronounce what is good and bad, beautiful and ugly, advantageous and disadvantageous. Without culture, human values are inchoate and indeterminate. Through culture, they become differentiated, articulated, and refined. So one of his great examples is rock and roll, and he says, look, you couldn't begin to appreciate rock and roll until there were electric guitars, right? There wasn't an aesthetic of rock and roll until we had certain kinds of instruments. And the same is true of the piano or the violin or these sorts of things, that our sensibilities of aesthetic value evolve and change over time, given what is available to value. So that's a model in aesthetics, you might say, and he wants to say the same thing in the moral domain. In particular, as I mentioned, he said, we have an indeterminate sense of justice, and that indeterminate sense of justice can be realized in many different ways. So it's not just that there may be different ways of exemplifying well-defined abstract rules or procedures, whether they're aesthetic or political. Rather, because our ultimate values are indeterminate, any attempt to render them determinate will be specific to cultural and material conditions. So it may not be transposable to other contexts. So we have an kind of indeterminate sense of justice, and then we say, okay, that indeterminate sense is going to have to be made determinate right here in this culture. How are we going to do that? The way we're going to do it should depend on the particular circumstances, the cultural traditions, the material conditions, etc. So a cultural techne is an evolving and contested specification of our inchoate and indeterminate drive to evaluate in response to these material, biological, geographical conditions. It's not just evaluation, I overstated there, because the cultural techne is not all about evaluation, it includes evaluation, but that's a space where what we're doing is trying to make more determinate our values, our understanding, so that we can use that in interacting with each other and coordinating. Contestation over meanings will, of course, reflect struggles of power and conflicting interests. So the cultural techne is not like this simple hegemonic, we're all doing it this way, because that's another reason why it's a toolbox. There's going to be different tools that we use in different contexts in response to different circumstances, and some people are going to have tools that we don't want to participate with and interact with, and others will rely on those tools. And it's a matter of hard work to figure out what should belong in the dominant techne and what should belong in the sort of more marginalized technes, let's put it that way. Okay, so there's two dimensions of indeterminacy. Synchronic, any appreciation of the value of reciprocity or a sense of justice that might provide a basis for moral theorizing across social and cultural differences at a time is indeterminate. And our efforts to articulate it in a way that renders it determinate will inevitably incorporate these socio-historical elements that make it apt for some contexts or communities or not for others. So there's going to be difficulty in sort of making these, looking like we're talking about the same thing sometimes when we're talking about justice in different communities, because they've made it, the communities have made that indeterminate sense of justice more determinate in very different sorts of ways. And diachronically, even if we're able to specify a conception of justice that's fully determinate and applies generally at a time, which I suggested it's going to be really hard to do, we're not in a position to grasp the full range of possibilities that we might face and decide in advance what would be appropriate under significantly different conditions. So the robot, right? What are we going to do with robots, right? How are we going to interact with them? How are we going to take them into our moral community? Are we going to take them into our moral community? And there's so many other sorts of things, cloning and IVF and all of these sorts of practices that are well beyond what people had even thought of 50, 60 years ago, but we have to think about how we're going to make our indeterminate sense of justice such that it will address some of these concerns. So the world poses challenges our previous or existing understandings and sensibilities don't solve. Our sensibilities evolve in response to new conditions, and the evolving sensibilities and critique of them is part of the process of determining what is just here and now. Not too fast? It's okay. Anyone too fast? Good? Okay. Okay. So path dependency also allows that our indeterminate values are modified as we develop ways to concretize them. So perhaps ways in which we concretize our ultimate values puts them in tension, and one of them comes to take priority. So there used to be, really substantial honor cultures that were very, very important. And there are lots of explanations of why honor societies sort of collapsed. Some people think inclusion, equality, blah, 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 economic conditions. There are lots of different reasons why. But it seems as though there were competing values that were maybe efforts to concretize something quite abstract. And we said, well, maybe we're not going to concretize that one anymore. Maybe that one, we have a sense of what honor is, but it's not serving us. So that can happen. Our sensibilities evolve in response to the current challenges at both the abstract and the concrete level, while also maintaining a degree of continuity. Now this, I think, is important, that values vary in determinacy. For as long as our ultimate values are relatively indeterminate, there's logical space to agree while also having conflicts over how to concretize them. And I think this often happens, where you say, I don't think that's fair. And you say, well, I think it is fair. And then you say, well, let's talk about what fairness should be. And in a particular historical context, there can be a shared sense of this indeterminate value that's being exemplified in different ways. And oftentimes you can actually just look at empirical evidence of the consequences of your policies, and someone say, oh yeah, no, that isn't so fair, is it? Right? So there's all different ways. This indeterminacy offers lots of ways in which we can accommodate contestation, disagreement, and such, and move forward. However, and this is from Balkan again, human beings can also generate ever new examples of injustice and oppression in different times and places. In different times and places, human beings find new ways to work evils on their fellow creatures and to create monuments to brutality and repulsiveness. Sorry, I botched that. That was not a good reading of that bit of text, but there it is. Okay, so yeah, that's obvious. Okay, however, path dependency does not leave critique without normative resources. So it's not as if, oh my gosh, it's all going to be just differences on the ground in some vague, happy, indeterminate sense in the abstract, and so we're going to not have really resources for critique, and I think that that's not true. The fact that ultimate indeterminate values are agreed upon across contexts is a resource for a critique. So, for example, you could say this is wrong. Social critique can, at the very least, draw on our inchoate and indeterminate sense of justice to demand a better alternative to the current practices, police violence, women's second shift, etc. This is so much better. Experiencing a different way of life due to travel, crisis, literature, art can reveal that the default way of life is damaging, and a different way of going on is more fitting with our ultimate values. So the big quit was one. The big quit, that's the way they talk about it in the US. Maybe they don't here. When lots of people quit their jobs under COVID, right? And because they went, I'm not going to do that stupid, oppressive, essential worker job, for almost nothing and risk my life, et cetera, et cetera. And so they just quit. And as many of us have discovered, working from home is kind of good. So we can do that sometimes instead of going to the office. Why not here too? So the fragmentation of our social practices and relative but incomplete autonomy of social systems generates tensions and contradictions that can prompt reflection and reconfiguration of our normative resources. So this is something that Du Bois and others have talked about as double consciousness. So and Du Bois's idea was that African Americans post-slavery or even during slavery would have the consciousness of what it was like to be around white people and live in the white world, but also in the black world, and that double consciousness was a resource for them. Another story that I love, my sister, who's quite a bit older than I am, was a stay-home mom for many years, more than a decade, and she went back to work. And I was talking to her one day and said, hey, what do you think of going to work every day and your new job? And she said, well, it's so interesting. Like, when I was at home with the kids, I could have lunch whenever I was hungry. I didn't have to have lunch between 12 and 1. And I'm sometimes not hungry between 12 and 1. And why do I have to have lunch then? But she says, on the other hand, at work, I do the littlest thing and I get this great credit for it. People think I'm awesome. So no one ever thinks I'm awesome at home. So there's this way in which her recognition that she was not appreciated at home was something that she gained by going to work and being appreciated. Interesting, huh? Anyway, so there's those kinds of, it's actually what was so cool about her, because she's not a radical or an activist at all. She's a Trump supporter, but oh no, anyway. But to be honest, she actually lobbied with her friends at work to try and allow flex time at lunchtime so that they could like do a 20-minute workout class or something. And I was like, yes, go Mary. Okay. This is unworkable. The point of coordination is to improve well-being, to achieve together what we couldn't do alone. When circumstances get very bad, it becomes clear that the terms of coordination are failing to even maintain basic well-being, as in refugee camps, homelessness, industrial agriculture. So it's connected to this is wrong, but I think of them as slightly different. One of them is a kind of moral, this is a sense of justice, and the other is like, whoa, we're clearly not coordinating effectively, which is maybe the same, maybe not. I'm not assuming they're the same. Okay, so these forms of critique will not necessarily be convincing to others if they don't share near enough ultimate values, if they disagree about what's feasible, if they disagree about the likely outcomes, if they're deeply invested in the current practices, or if they're benefiting greatly from how things are. But social change can happen without convincing anyone of anything, because social change is happening all the time, right? You can't stop it. It is just happening. But of course, we want more than just that laissez-faire sort of attitude towards social change. At the same time, moral disagreement is not a basis for moral skepticism, right? So you and I can disagree, and that doesn't mean that I have to become a moral skeptic, because maybe you're wrong and maybe I'm wrong, right? That happens a lot, I think. And so we don't have to assume if there's disagreement, then we can't go on based on the values that we have. But as I mentioned, we can't just let things drift. We're seeking transformational change and intervention is needed. But social movements don't require universal agreement in order to get started. It's enough to convince some others that there are better ways to live together and to make that happen. Transformational social change can happen and be justified in spite of disagreement and resistance. And you all know this is Martin Luther King, right? That's Martin Luther King, right? Civil rights movement. He was right. Those who disagreed with him were wrong. He didn't have to have universal agreement to go on and bring about changes. And he's still right, even though we haven't fulfilled his dream, right? And I will stand by that. Okay, so I think there are a couple of problems that arise when we're dealing with social change, and some of them are connected to what we were just looking at here about invested in the current practices and looking at what is feasible, etc. And I think that one of the issues is that individuals lose their bearings and sense of agency when their way of life is deeply challenged. And the movement must be sensitive to the fact that practices are valuable and produce goods that are internal to the practice. Those marked for a particular set of tasks may develop a set of skills, a sensibility, and solidarity with each other by virtue of participation in the structured set of practices. Goods may accrue to the participants even if overall the structure is problematic and should be changed. So here's a powerful quote from Sandra Barkey, and this is in The Modernization of Patriarchal Power. That's the subtitle. But anyway, you can find it. Whatever its ultimate effect, discipline, she's thinking of Foucauldian discipline, can provide the individual upon whom it is imposed with a sense of mastery as well as a secure sense of identity. For example, women, like other skilled individuals, have a stake in the perpetuation of their skills, whatever it may have cost them to acquire them, and quite apart from the question of whether, as a gender, they would have been better off had they never had to acquire them in the first place. Hence, feminism threatens women with a certain de-skilling, something people normally resist. Beyond this, it calls into question that aspect of personal identity which is tied to the development of a sense of competence. So in this, I'm thinking about, like, my mother, who never went to college. She was not well educated. She was committed wife and mother, and that was totally her identity. And when I suggested that that wasn't the path I was going to follow, she was just devastated by this. And she found, feminism a threat to her sense of herself. And so this kind of skill that she developed to, be a good wife and mother in a traditional way was something that she didn't want to give up because it was her identity, and it was something that required incredible skill. It wasn't until I had children that I realized what a skillful person she was, because I was very dismissive, like girls always are of their mothers, not always, often are of their mothers. Anyway, another problem, I think, is epistemic foreclosure. So individuals and groups face epistemic foreclosure due to uncertainty about options and feasibility. Social practices have significant epistemic effects. The schemas we employ, that's the part of the cultural techne, we employ to interpret the world, are confirmed by the world they have shaped. Thus, it becomes difficult to even see that schemas and practices are problematic, for they appear to be warranted. And the idea behind this is ideology can block imagination and a sense of possibility. So here's an example. We allow Nestle to drain local springs in order to bottle water, leaving a less potable public water supply, giving people reason to engage in the practice of drinking bottled water, thus reinforcing the decision to grant water rights to Nestle. This is a self-reinforcing system that provides reasons for people to act as they do, and it's hard to see a way out. Imagination and willingness to think and act beyond the immediate reality are needed. So here, my daughter, for example, she just drinks bottled water, and I go, no, look at that plastic, and blah, 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 and you're enriching Nestle, and blah, blah, blah. She can't see the possibilities of I don't like the taste of tap water, whatever. Anyway, so you can see that you sort of get caught up in the system and the possibilities of doing something different, and actually protesting against Nestle, for example, don't really seem real to you. So that's epistemic foreclosure. So social change, punctuated equilibria or incremental transformation. So this was thanks to the lunch colloquium, this whole section I added because it was impressed upon me that I was thinking about incremental change as like good enough, and maybe it's not good enough. And I agree, incremental change may not always be transformative. So we need to think about how, do we have to have a revolution every time something is like falling apart or whatever? No, or can we make do with just change, slow and incremental change? So here we go. At the end of the previous lecture, I claimed that transformative social movements depend on micro interventions that are responsive to the needs in individuals and their value, and build upon those relationships to change social relations and networks. And this is in the material systems rather than in patriarchy or capitalism writ large. This assumes that incremental transformative change is possible, but I think we should return to consider this more closely. Research on structural and institutional change has at times assumed that social structures are like cement columns that endure and sustain society as a whole and cannot be changed easily. These are, Greek columns, obviously. They've been there a really long time. So, if they're really big cement columns holding us all up, then you might wonder what's going to happen if you take them down. As a consequence, scholars have assumed that social change occurs when enduring historical pathways are periodically punctuated by moments of agency and choice. And this is supported in some ways by the recognition of path dependence. So if path dependence is saying, look, what you've got, I just talking about with the path dependence of value and everything, is these cement columns of society that are continuing on, then maybe the only way to get transformative social change is take down those columns, to maybe allow the roof to crash and then rebuild from there. The structures set the conditions within which change occurs, and in order to change the structures, a shock or critical juncture is required. And on this view of social change, punctuated equilibrium, a ruptural social movement, may be our best bet to achieve transformative social change. Now, I'm not sure what this means, actually. I'm not sure what these, dramatic ruptural changes and punctuations of the equilibrium are supposed to be. There's a gesture, it's something like a traditional revolution, but not necessarily a violent one. Actually, there are people in the US and their op-eds are saying that we're already undergoing a revolution in the US because of the various kinds of terrorism, local terrorism that's happening. People like in Charlottesville, Virginia, when there was a protest, having cars drive through the protest and such like that. I'm not going to take a stand on that, but there is an idea that, and a good friend of mine just published a book that the US ought to separate into 4 different countries. Whoa. Anyway, just saying. That would be revolutionary. That would be truly revolutionary. Chris Zern. Oh, some of you know Chris. Chris Zern. Anyway, he's a critical theorist too. And he just argued that it's called Splitsville. Anyway, just saying. A little ad for Chris. Okay. But of course it matters how one thinks of structures and their stability. And on the account I've offered, structures are not rigid. They're formed through practices that rely on culture and respond to material conditions. And culture is anything but fixed. As I argued in the last lecture, culture is open-ended and always evolving and responsive to our agency. In effect, the practical enactment of an institution is as much part of its reality as its formal structure, because the practices are providing that structure and we're the ones who are engaged in the practices. So guess what? Agency can make a difference. If we stop carrying on with the same practices and we change the material conditions that force others to do things differently, we change the culture so what they think things mean isn't what they mean. Whoa, radical transformative change. So Mahoney and Thielen also describe several other factors that introduce gaps in institutions. So assuming that structures consist of rules or norms or logics in the cultural techne, we have to pay attention to the fact that rules and norms require interpretation. If you like Wittgenstein, this is a Wittgensteinian point, that the rule following argument, and I'm not going to go into it, but I love it. But just so you know, if you're interested, that's what I'm referring to. Compliance is variable. Like, who follows all the rules all the time? Really? Nobody. Cognitive limits may make it difficult to anticipate consequences of following the norm. So norms get created and established, and then they go way wrong, right? And so we kind of find other ways to deal with that. Implicit norms are vague and allow for a variety of ways to comply. That's connected to the requiring interpretation. But it's a different point, which is that there's a vague norm, and there are like 7 different ways you can follow the norm because it's vague. And that allows that people will start, just doing it one way and not doing it those other ways if you push them hard enough. And also, not all norms or rules are enforced, and they shrivel up and die. Okay, so let's take a minute to look at the US feminist movement since 1970 in just the legal context. And I'm going to suggest that this was incremental change, incremental but transformative change. And I'm not going to read through all of these, give you a sense of them. I've been told that many of them are same in Germany. So in 1969, I think Princeton and Yale allowed women to enroll. So women were allowed to enroll in Ivy League schools. Columbia didn't allow women to enroll in it until 1986. Okay, so that in 1972 women couldn't be evaluated based on. Could be evaluated based on different standards. Couldn't access birth control, could be turned down for a loan. Anyway, you get the idea. There are lots of things that happened since 1970 and all the way up to 2015. So there are lots of things that have changed. I think it's pretty transformative. I think that things are really different now than what they were for lots of different reasons. So the women's liberation movement appears to have achieved these successes incrementally, and yet it has been transformative. But we should be somewhat qualified, I think, in our enthusiasm. It has not made a difference to all women, at least to the same degree. White, affluent, able-bodied, heterosexual cis women have benefited the most, sometimes at the expense of other minoritized members of groups. Matters that are much more important to minoritized women have been neglected. Reproductive justice, as opposed to just pro-choice, is something that has been a long-standing controversy between black feminists and white feminists, for example. Prison and immigration reform and settler colonialism. Most of the changes fall within a liberal paradigm, and it's no longer clear, especially the Dobbs decision that overturned the right to an abortion, that the gains are secure. And so the women's movement has failed along many dimensions, and where it succeeded formally, the legal implementation has been uneven based on race and class. And that was as you say, the enforcement. It can work, for white women, but not work for other women. So some of the failings, I think, are the result of loss of bearings and epistemic foreclosure. So I think that there wasn't a sufficient effort to be inclusive in the movement from the 70s until now. And also I think that there was the epistemic foreclosure, there was not enough effort to resist dominant ideological paradigms. But if we do that, then the thought might be that incremental change can be more transformative, and I'm hoping that it can. So how does incremental transformation occur, and what is the role of a social movement in promoting it? Even just considering formal institutions, different strategies have become evident. And this is, again, from Mahoney and Thielen. They're political scientists. They spend a lot of time thinking about formal institutions. But I think that what they're pointing to is something that we can also find in informal institutions. So changes to the cultural techne. So they have in mind displacement and layering. Displacement is the removal of existing rules and the introduction of new ones. So eligibility for jury service, access to birth control and sexual harassment law, and layering, the introduction of new rules on top of or alongside existing ones, like rape law continued and then marital rape was added, financial credit expansion and such like that. So thinking about it in the cultural techne, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, you can imagine that sometimes the norm just kind of dies away, right? So the norm of opening doors for women. Yeah, not that many people do it anymore, thank goodness. Look at me. I can open a door all by myself, So, and there's ways in which we can layer on top of gender various other sorts of non-binary possibilities or trans possibilities that's layered on top of the possibilities of still being a man or a woman in a more traditional sense. Changes to the background material conditions, they're talking about drift, the changed impact of existing rules, norms, practices due to shifts in the environment, as in increasing numbers of women entering Congress and educational gains. So norms about what, at MIT, they didn't have, they were mostly men. They didn't rule out women being in it, but they were almost all men, mostly all white men, with plastic pocket protectors. I don't know if have those in Germany, but we have them in the U.S. Anyway, that's a joke that I had to have an American audience, I think. But anyway, so they didn't have enough toilets for women. They didn't have in the health center, they didn't have gynecologists or anyone that could deal with women's bodies. And so there had to be change, right? There had to be change because there was the changed impact of existing rules was that women couldn't find a place to use the toilet, right? And so they made new toilets. Conversion, but they still have buildings where it's like men on the first floor, women on the second floor, men on the third floor, because they didn't actually want to build new ones. They just took the urinals out of the, anyway. Conversion, the changed enactment of existing rules, norms due to their strategic redeployment. So they have in mind domestic violence protection, so assault law. So in the US, it used to be that if you were assaulted in your home, it didn't really count as assault. And what feminists said is, wait a minute, why should it count differently whether I'm on the street or at home if I'm assaulted? That was a redeployment of assault law to sort of make it the case that domestic violence was a felony. Civil rights laws were used to gain marriage equality, so arguments about equality that were put into the civil rights legislation made it possible for women to use that to gain, or LGBTQ people to gain marriage equality. Okay. So in the US, sometimes the term social movement is equated with activism, understood as disruptive resistance and associated with ruptural change. But effective activism requires organizing. And I think this is where we can begin to think about the incremental change. It's not always in these big, loud, messy, wonderful, empowering, and fabulous demonstrations that I love, but in the organizing. So this is Astra Taylor, and she has a wonderful book. She has several wonderful books and a movie. Anyway, organizing is cooperative by definition. It aims to bring others into the fold, to build and exercise shared power. Raising awareness can be extremely valuable, but education is not organizing, which involves not just enlightening whoever happens to encounter your message, but also aggregating people around common interests so they can strategically wield their combined strength. Organizing is long-term and often tedious work that entails creating infrastructure and institutions, finding points of vulnerability and leverage in the situation you want to transform, and convincing atomized individuals to recognize that they're on the same team and to behave like it. So I think a lot of really important social movement has to happen through organizing in concrete institutions that we're all part of, where we know the leverage points and we know how to push on them, and then we organize together to push in the same direction. So, organizing provides opportunities to create new practices, build new skills, and develop strategies of resilience. It involves new ways of seeing and feeling that come with critique, and new ways of acting that come with practice. One of the ways that ideology disempowers us is by narrowing our sense of possibility, constraining our imaginations, and bridling our agency. But organizing can disrupt ideology because it gives us new ways of seeing and feeling. Through collective efforts to create new tools, both cultural and material, we can become powerful agents of social change or agents of possibility. Okay, now I'm going to talk to you about co-design. I get very passionate about this, so be prepared. Buckle your seatbelts and all of that. Okay, community-based problem solving. There are many different kinds of movements that address different circumstances in different communities. I'm going to sketch one approach of organizing and argue that it provides a way to change practices that is sensitive to the path dependence of value and also addresses the loss of bearings and epistemic foreclosure. So the D-Lab program, where I teach at MIT, I also teach in philosophy and women's studies, I just teach all over the place, seeks to address global poverty challenges through co-design that is inclusive, accessible, and sustainable. A substantial motivation for the program is to provide an alternative to standard forms of neocolonial and neoliberal development. So this is a picture from an article in an African press that has a hashtag No White Saviors, and that's picking up from the anti-development post-colonial work. And so traditional development programs have often assumed that liberalism and capitalism provide the only or the best framework for a good life, or more cynically, they seek to create new workers and new markets to exploit in the pursuit of corporate profit. Such programs often impose top-down policies that are not well informed about the local circumstances and are rightly regarded as paternalistic, ethnocentric, and extractive. Some claim to empower communities, but have often a limited sense of local agency, values, or capabilities. And again, cynically, they often use the languages of empowerment to recruit entrepreneurs to invest in communities for profit. And this, I work in Kenya, as you'll see in a minute, and I went to an organization at MIT that is supposed to be working on water and food security. And I said, you should come work with me. And I gave them all this whole thing about why and what they could do, et cetera, et cetera. And it was one of those, speed dating things where after you gave your pitch, people would come and meet. No one met me. No one came over and talked to me. So I went to the director and I said, I thought I gave a great pitch. Why did no one come talk to me? And she said, you need entrepreneurs. That's the only way to have it be sustainable. And I said, entrepreneurs? This is a place where people don't have food to eat, right? Anyway, you get the idea. This still happens. Although development has a bad name, those in the global north and elsewhere should also take some responsibility for the ongoing damage that's being done by global capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. Doing nothing, if you have the ability, is not ethically defensible. There are local challenges in the global north as well, and these should be addressed. The issue, to my mind, isn't about which social justice work is more important. It's about working where and how you can to be effective and sustain your commitment. Okay, so here's the core strategy of DLAB. You might have seen this before. I don't know, this is like one of those sayings that you see a lot in the US, if you give someone a fish, they eat for a day. But no, if their culture allows them to eat the fish you offer, I wouldn't eat if someone gave me a fish. I would say, no, thank you. If you teach someone to fish, they can feed themselves until the water is contaminated or the shoreline is seized for the development. If you teach someone to think critically and be politically conscious, then whatever the challenge, they can organize with their peers and stand up for their interests. We're getting there, right? We're getting there. But if you also engage them in the design process, they become agents in changing relationships, social norms, and material conditions. So this is where we want to go. Engaging people who are experiencing global poverty or many, many, many other things. I think this could be done even in my department, co-design, but of course I could never get my colleagues to do it. But I think you could do it virtually anywhere to deal with social justice issues. Okay, so this is Amy Smith. She's the founder of DLAB, and her famous quote is, impact is not just the product of innovation, it is the process of innovation. So you engage people in the process of designing solutions to the problems that they identify. So there are two steps, public narrative and co-design. And I've chose those, even though the methodology is quite elaborate, because I want to highlight how they can be used to address loss of bearings and epistemic foreclosure. As I understand it, movement building typically begins with consciousness raising, but consciousness raising is not something you do to someone, but you do with others. It's a collective process by which a desiring negation is transformed into a justified complaint and ultimately a demand. And Iris Young describes this starting point. Desire creates the distance, the negation that opens the space for criticism of what is. This critical distance does not occur on the basis of some previously discovered rational ideas of the good and the just. On the contrary, the ideas of the good and the just arise from the desiring negation that action brings to what is given. Each social reality presents its own unrealized possibilities, experienced as lacks and desires, and norms and ideals arise from the yearning that is an expression of freedom. It does not have to be this way. It could be otherwise. So I think that this is very compatible with the idea of the path dependency of value, because yes, you have this vague and inchoate sense of what would be fair or just or flourishing or whatever, but you then are stuck in a situation where it's not working that way. It just doesn't feel right. And so you get this desiring negation. And that desiring negation is the moment when critique can happen. Now, not all desiring negations are good, as I often say. I sometimes think of some kinds of desiring negation of whining. Whining like when my children, who would whine when I wouldn't give them more cookies or more whatever, a desiring negation of no more cookies, you know. So, but in this paper I reference there, I talk about how you build from desiring negation to a proper complaint to a demand. I'm not going to go into the details, but we'll talk more about it. So here is Marshall Ganz. He's developed this concept of public narrative. He says movements have narratives. They tell stories because they're not just about rearranging economics and politics. They also rearrange meaning, cultural techne, think cultural techne. And they're not just about redistributing the goods. They're about figuring out what is good. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why kind of the liberal model that was so predominant in the women's liberation model, it was just thinking we're going to redistribute things and we're going to make the economics and politics better, but it has to be more than that. So on Gans's view, public narrative is valuable because it enables participants to connect values with action. And he has this concept of a story of self, a story of us, and a story of now. So narrative, I'm going to talk about that. Narrative is not talking about values. It embodies and communicates those values. It's through the shared experience of our values that we engage with others, motivate one another to act, find the courage to take risks, explore possibility, and face the challenges that we must face. So the first step, individuals come together and each narrate a story of self that shares the individual's experiences with the challenge in question. There's a challenge that's been put forward, and the values that have made a difference for them at important choice points. The process is not just a spontaneous outpouring. Participants are given tools to think about their experiences, identify the choice points, and find ways to articulate the values that mattered in making decisions. The second stage is after everyone listens to the stories of self from others in the group, they collectively create a story of us that connects the experiences and the values of the participants. This too is a scaffolded project that shows participants how to compare their different social positions and how those positions are related. And then the third step is the story of now. Having constructed a shared story that connects their experiences and their values, the group develops a story of now. From Ganz, a story of now, in a story of now, we're the protagonists, and it's our choices that shape the outcome. We draw on our moral sources to find the courage, hope, and empathy, perhaps to respond. And the story of now can take several meetings of the group to develop and several rounds of feedback and revision. But the goal is to articulate the urgent choice faced by us, meaning the people in that group and that community that is meeting together that requires action, a challenging vision of what will happen if we do not act, a hopeful vision of what could be if we do act, and a call to choose commitment to the action required. The choice we offer must be more than we can all choose to be better people, or we must all choose to do any of one of this following 53 things. A meaningful choice requires action we can take now, action we can take together, and an outcome that we can achieve. Okay, so this is the organization I work with in Kenya, and we last year, just over a year ago, we worked with teenagers in 4 high schools and 5 high schools and one group of teenagers who dropped out of school. All of them were girls. And one of the issues that was important was that girls were dropping out of school at puberty. And this was a matter of concern because staying in school is really important for lots and lots of reasons in terms of your well-being, the well-being of the community, et cetera. This is a community where there's terrible food insecurity, where the HIV rate for women is 27% higher than the rate for men. Many of the girls, I think it's almost 50% of the girls have their first birth before they're 18. Many of them as young as 13 or 14. So it's an issue of how it is and why it is that girls are dropping out of school as soon as they reach puberty. So we asked them to do a story of self and say, okay, talk to us about what happened when you reached puberty. And they was hesitant. They didn't want to talk about it because, of course, like everywhere in the globe, menstruation is shameful, right? Everywhere. There is very, blood, menstrual blood is shameful. I'm not saying you think it's shameful, but culturally, it's shameful. And so they didn't want to talk about it, but then we have various techniques to encourage people to talk, and they each went around and told their story of their first menstruation, how they didn't know what was happening to them, they were terrified, it was confusing, they didn't have any menstrual products, and they felt like they couldn't go to school. And so then they would miss a certain amount of school every month, and they would fall way behind, and then they would be ashamed that they were falling so far behind, et cetera, so they would drop out. Okay, so we had those stories of self, all of them, and the girls around were going, oh my God, the same thing happened to me. I have the same issues. I dropped out of school too. And so over time, what happened, we went through these processes, and we had them come up with a story of now that was, okay, what can we do now? One of the things they decided on was to create posters that they could put in schools to explain what menstruation was. Another thing was to design reusable menstrual pads so that they could sew. We taught them to sew, and they could sew. At this point, it was still, at this point for this workshop, we were teaching them how to sew with needle and thread and giving them fabric so that they could try and experiment with different ways of doing it. Okay, so another example, this is still on the public narrative part. Oh, and this is a picture of the different menstrual products that they created in their bags. They also need wet bags. This is a wet bag. This is a final product. That's Monica. And because the very few homes in the area have running water. And so being able to change a pad at school or keep it until you can get water to wash it is an issue. So they also develop wet bags. And these are some of the menstrual products they designed, and they had a display for the whole community, and they didn't have to be quite as ashamed because they had each other. Okay, this is the Alliance for Responsible Mining in Colombia, and this is a place where my co-teacher, Libby McDonald, works. And in gold mining, artisanal gold mining, many women have very little choice about making a living in these parts of Colombia because there's been such terrible deforestation and economic appropriation that really sex work and gold mining are the two main things that they choose between if they're poor. And so, but they go into the gold mining, and what they find is that there's a lot of gender-based violence. They go into these mining communities that are dominated by men, and then there's a lot of gender-based violence. So we had them talk about the experiences of gender-based violence and then map where it was in the supply chain for the gold mining. This person experienced it here, and this person experienced it here, and this person experienced it here. So they started to develop a systems view of the supply chain for gold mining and what were the points of vulnerability. And that happened in the story of self and the story of us, because they were trying to map where it's happening, and then the story of now. And eventually they decided they've formed basically kind of like a union, a collaborative of how they can work together to try and protect themselves from gender-based violence, and they're now trying to gain formalization in the government. Formalize their work so that they have health care and other kinds of protections. Okay, so narrative we talked about. I think that the work they're doing in the narrative is building a theory about their social context and where are the gaps, where are the lacuna. where things are not happening as they should. It's a systems way of thinking about things. And then we move to co-design and practice. So it's important to emphasize that stories are not just about personal sharing, they're structured activities that give the participants skills to identify choice points and articulate values, to engage in comparative analysis where vulnerability occurs, which is systems thinking, to consider what power they have in the setting and how they can build on what each has to offer to address the issues. And in addition, the workshops teach skills in listening, coaching others to find their voice, offering constructive feedback, and sorting through disagreements to find common ground. So this is the design cycle. So it goes around and around and around, but often you'll start by identifying opportunities for improvement through public narrative, gather information, define the challenge, think of ideas, choose the best one, work out the details, build a prototype, get feedback, and identify opportunities for improving it, and go around and around and around. And what D-Lab does is teach this design process to everybody that we're working with. This is when A.B. Smith said, it's not about the product, it's about the process, because this design process can be used in many, many, many different contexts. Okay, so the method for teaching the design cycle involves several elements not described in the figure. Hands-on exercises are used to brainstorm who are the stakeholders and how should they be involved. Are there others who aren't currently in the group who should be included? Are there others who might offer support or create hurdles? This is something that the women's liberation movement could have done, is done a little bit more stakeholder analysis. Thinking outside the box. How can ordinary objects and activities be used in new ways? What things are considered waste that might be reframed as resources? And what might be adapted to suit our purposes? This is one of the standard exercises. We give people two pieces of paper, nothing else, no staples, no tape, no nothing. And there's a contest to build a structure. Well, sometimes it's bananas, sometimes it's books, sometimes whatever. Who's going to be able to build a structure that can hold the greatest weight, the most bananas or the most books? And this is a way of thinking outside the box. There are lots of other exercises we do to try and reconsider what is waste. And what hands-on skills and tools are needed to build the prototype, and can they be taught to everyone? For example, we teach women to weld, and we teach men to sew, right? It's not gender-based skill learning. The emphasis is on solutions that can be designed and implemented with what's at hand. This can involve skills from training from welding to sewing, from computer coding to brickmaking. And later, participants use these skills and technologies in their homes and share them with their communities. And this promotes affordability, sustainability, and local control. Okay, this is a team in Bolivia that went just this January to work with the eco-recoletoras, who are the waste pickers in dumps, who live in the dumps and pick waste, and they're becoming now recycling specialists. We're doing that. Oh, I don't want to talk about that. Okay, so relevant features of co-design is organizing. So development through co-design is a form of local interstitial organizing. So it's not the ruptural, it's the how do you find the cracks, and how do you find the spaces in the current practices to intervene. That addresses some of the problems with more standard development programs. It's also compatible with the aims of critical theory and points to some ways that critical theory might be developed to enable and support on-the-ground change. I left the word out, sorry, on the ground change. It draws on situated knowledge of local challenges, culture, and resources. The knowledge gained can also be critical. Community members are shifting perspectives by engaging in the project of public narrative, entering into dialogue with members of other groups, and learning skills that change the possibilities for agency. I think this prompts paradigm shifts, like, I don't have to be ashamed of menstruating? Whoa, that's different. I mean, not me, right? I'm way past that. But it speaks to local norms and values while providing opportunities to realize the values in different ways. The community seeks creative new ways to realize their values, and in doing so, existing social norms are reconsidered. I think this really helps with the loss of bearings issue, both providing opportunities for agency in shaping the new social practices and relations, and utilizing specialized skills in new ways. Remember, the loss of bearings was, oh my God, I don't know how to do anything but be a wife and mother, and now you're telling me that's not good? Well, what am I supposed to do? Do I have agency? How do the values that I have and that have been implemented in my life thus far, how do they carry me forward? And this is something I think is very well addressed, because you're building in the community a sense of where they want to go and how they can use their skills going forward. Critical knowledge helps with epistemic foreclosure. Remember, epistemic foreclosure was the Nestle example. You just can't figure out how you're going to get around it. You can't drink the tap water because it's so bad, but you don't want to drink the bottled water because Nestle's making a profit, and so you're kind of stuck. What are your options? So gaps in current practices are identified, and stakeholders engage in creative efforts to address them together by considering what resources are available and what skills they can offer. So oftentimes what you find is that women who already knew how to sew, I mean, this is not in the menstrual product sort of workshop, but in others, women who know how to sew or know how to do other sorts of things, they'll be trying to figure something out, because some of them have men and women, and the guys will go, well, we can't do that. We don't have any way to do that. And then the women say, aha, yes, we do. I can sew it, or whatever like that. And so it does sort of reconfigure who has skills. I think that's really important. And more outcomes. It teaches transposable skills that can be used to address multiple challenges, so the whole design process. Learning new skills and designing together reveals that those considered incompetent are not, and they gain recognition and respect. It builds self-confidence and buy-in. Learning new skills together is empowering individually and also collectively. It builds community through a recognition of shared values and collaboration and acting on them. So when the design addresses the existing challenge, it inspires commitment to the process, the community, and the outcome. And it does allow for entrepreneurship, so the menstrual pad product is something that they're now selling, but it's made by them in their community. It changes practices ultimately, it changes practices in social relations, and this changes structures, both cultural and material. Design thinking is broadly useful because it transforms desiring negation to agency with new skills. Things that were taken to be inevitable are recognized to be contingent. So once you get the new practices off the ground, it does begin to change things like who's going to be educated and what is going to happen to them, going forward. Are they going to be sexually abused and pregnant, or are they going to stay in school and have a chance to become important figures in their communities? Okay, this is another invention that came up with, that D-Lab came up with. It's Steve, my husband, has a version of one of these, but this one is made out of bicycle parts, because people who are disabled in areas where there aren't lots of resources for the disabled, and especially if they have to go through sand, they can't get around. But one of the things that was designed in one of the communities was a wheelchair that can be used in sand made out of bicycle parts. So another one that's really cool is the BC Lavadora, where they took an oil drum and put it so that it would be run by a bicycle and made into a washing machine. Cool. Anyway, I told you I kind of get a little bit excited about it. So why are structural and systematic injustice so hard to combat? My view is they're embedded in complex systems that are self-organizing and self-sustaining. What critical conditions can make a difference? Changes in agency, culture, and material conditions that make up the practices structuring the system. How does co-design help? Well, it doesn't always help. You can't always be successful, but at least in some cases, situated knowers gain a critical standpoint by collectively creating alternative practices that produce new forms of value, that enhance capabilities, and are, to the best of our knowledge, determinations of our or their indeterminate sense of justice. So, question. The important question remains, however, whether and when local changes of this sort build on each other to create transformative change, right? This is incremental change. Is it incremental transformative change? Is it incremental adaptive change? Is it actually ever going to make a difference? I'm going to talk some about that next time because we're going to look at a really hard problem, and I'm going to try and suggest that there is a way to transform these kinds of interventions into something that can be much more transformative. But I haven't done that today. I'm just trying to get you a feel of on-the-ground stuff. So I haven't made a case. Plausibly, such efforts will be most likely to have transformative effects if they're combined with others and have stable support. In Kenya, the Society Empowerment Project has developed multiple projects to empower girls and women. It's been successful in supporting girls as they continue in school and earn college degrees. These are important steps towards status and recognition in the community that can give them influence in local decision making. And evidence suggests from JPAL, which is the Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT that does all of this empirical economics, that when women hold office in local communities, they're more likely to work to increase provision of public services and improve perceptions of women as leaders. So here's an example. I'm not sure how well you can see it. This is the soccer team. So Society Empowerment Project works significantly through creating soccer teams so that girls, create teams and get strong and they have each other, and then that's part of how this all works. And I'm not sure you can see, but this is their practice jersey. It says "Stop Sexual Violence," free SMS, and then a number. So this is, the team had done some of this processing. They weren't doing menstrual pads, but they were dealing with domestic violence and sexual violence in the community, and they made these T-shirts, or had the T-shirts made. And this is some school children trying to make sense of a picture of a uterus and fallopian tubes, and menstruation is a process of monthly blood. So this is a kind of, I'm suggesting could potentially be more sustainable if you've got an organization that's sort of helping it continue, and we're going to talk about more of that next time. But how can we build on this model? In the next layer, I'm going to discuss the challenge of the gender division of caregiving and how building social change networks can extend the reach of such incremental change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally, for this, again, incredibly rich and complex and lively lecture. Just like yesterday, we have some time for the Q&A. There are two microphones on the right and on the left of the auditorium where you can please line up if you have a question. And yeah, we can get started right away, please.
Okay, thank you so much. In my experience, activists from the Global South often have a very clear idea of what they need and how they want to go about, and what kinds of structures are prohibiting them from going about, which often come from the Global North. And then when deliberating together, like how to change that, which often has to do with economics, then there seems to be a kind of block to incremental change. And I wanted to know from you what you think about, you said at one point that maybe it's not always incremental change that is all that does the job. What is that point, and what can we do then, also relating to the point economics has in your account of social structures? Like, is it something specific that maybe blocks more than other structures do?
Yeah, I think I heard a couple questions in there. One question was about the economics of what do you do when they know what they want but they can't afford it. But there was another one about how people in the Global South know what they need, and so, mainly we just need to give them money so they can do it. And are those two questions?
It was more meant capitalism, like the structure, like how companies exploit and how things are prohibited from being sustainable by the capitalist system.
Yeah, so I don't agree with that. I mean, I think capitalism does do that in some places, but I don't think that what happens in development is that people get this idea. So I can give you an example of the Bolivia example of the recolectores. I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish, and I'm sorry, I just completely destroyed that word. But so we went down there, and they said, oh, there's this really wonderful machine that's made in Germany, and it's going to help us so much, and we really want it. So couldn't you just buy it for us? And we went through a process of carefully investigating. Well, part of what D-Lab thinks is that if you bring a fancy machine from the global north to the global south that no one knows how to fix, that costs a lot of money, it's probably not going to solve their problems. So what we did is we went through a very elaborate process of trying to identify what were the hurdles they were facing, and what were the risks of change in different ways, and what would be sustainable. And we came up with some solutions that they're much happier with than getting a fancy German-made, or, I mean, I'm sorry, that happened to be German-made, but I'm not trying to blame Germany, right? Piece of equipment that you then drop there, and then it breaks in a year, and nobody knows how to fix it. Do you have an idea of how many machines are scattered across Africa that nobody knows how to fix and are just rusted, right? That's not the solution. And so I think that thinking, oh, well, what we really need to do is get capitalism to sort of sell them something that now they can afford because we've given them the money, is a very bad way to think about social change. I think that there are a lot of solutions that can be developed very locally, very sustainably, and actually serve the needs of the people in the community much better. Now, of course, there are going to be some cases where that's not true, but we have ways of creating sterile, well, there are lots of places in the world where they don't have operating rooms that are sterile. But there's a thing that was designed by D-Lab where it's this kind of balloon thing that you can use to make possible sterile surgery in all different kinds of places. And you think, oh, well, what we really need is a fancy emergency room with an operating. No, that's not necessarily going to be the best thing. Or you think about, I mean, another thing is ambulances. There are motorcycle ambulances that have been developed in taking into account, and say they have motorcycles and bicycles. Those are available. And I just really think that, yes, there are going to be some cases where you need to have, fancy equipment, but that's just another way of getting people caught up in capitalism to think that they need to buy something with lots of money that some, global north corporation has created. And I just don't think that's the best way.
I thought the point was partly to say that the fact that this all happens within a global capitalist system imposes constraints on, like structural constraints on the ways in which these local communities can be empowered, let's say, and the ways in which their knowledge can travel or be scaled up.
Oh, for sure. Oh, there's sure. But I thought the question was, look, it was more that one. Sorry, I got carried away. Of course there's constraints. We're all constrained. I mean, yes, you can't make menstrual pads unless you have waterproof fabric. And capitalism, you can't buy that in Kenya. In Kenya, you also can't, there are no plastic bags. There's a law against plastic bags. So you can't just use plastic bags. So they have to go to Uganda to get waterproof fabric or plastic. And so that's a constraint that you're facing. But I'm not sure, first of all, I'm not sure that people know what they want and need. I don't know what I want and need. That's not just a question about, the poor people in the global south, they don't know what they want, Who knows what you want and need, right? That's a huge challenge to figure that out, what you could make do with, et cetera. And then the second is I really do think that there are constraints, but it doesn't seem to me obvious that the constraints are debilitating to make possible what they need to do. There are going to be some debility. I think it's less capitalism and more the World Bank and the IMF and that. That's more of a problem in a lot of these developing countries than capitalism per se. Of course, they're the apparatus of capitalism, but No. Did I miss the question again?
We can figure that out
Of
later,
course
maybe.
it's like constraining. Like what? Who's thinking that it's not constraining? I'm just thinking that giving people money is not the solution.
There's another question over there.
Yeah, hello. First, thank you very much for the very insightful lecture, and really appreciate your call for like more participatory approach in general. And yeah, I kind of find it rather ironic that the D Lab and you're kind of located at the same institution at which JPAL and all that economists are located, which approach stands in rather contrast to what you're doing.
Yeah, it's not even JPAL. It's these. The JPAL has its good and its bad. I agree.
Yeah.
But there's others that are worse.
They definitely have that more like top-down approach
Totally.
and doing experiments, I would say, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I kind of have two questions. So first, I would be really interested in your perspective on what economists see as like systematic evidence and kind of their view of or their epistemic approach on, especially in that regard, because there's no, I would assume no like systematic evidence on your co-design approach. And so that would be my first question. My second would be if I maybe kind of a clarification on your perspective on like procedural justice in contrast to justice and outcomes, because what I see in that co-design approach is kind of like strong weight on procedural justice, assuming that it always produces like always also justice and outcomes, kind of. But yeah, that would be it, kind of. Thanks. Thanks.
Great. Yes. So we don't have. So the way JPAL works, just so you know about empirical economics, is that they find two villages in India, or two villages in Kenya, or two villages wherever in Uganda that are similar in size and population and face similar problems. This one of the most famous examples about mosquito nets, and then they may have three of them, and they have one where they give the mosquito nets away, another where they have to pay for the mosquito nets a certain amount, and then one where they have to pay less for the mosquito nets. And then they go back and they figure out which community used the mosquito nets. And interestingly, it wasn't the community where they gave the mosquito nets away for free. So then they feel like they have an empirical evidence that the best thing to do is charge for mosquito nets. And so, because then people will use them more. And they, but it wasn't the really expensive ones, it was the ones that were a small charge. Okay, so that's the kind of thing it does. So another thing it's done with, it's done investigations of villages in India where they have quotas of women serving in, on city town village councils, and those where they don't have those quotas, to look at what the spending process was. And that was what I had referred to here, that in places where they have quotas of women, and this we also have other evidence, not JPAL evidence about Uganda, that that in places where women, there are quotas for women on city and village councils, they're more likely to put that money into common good resource, things like that, water and health and such. It's also, though, in Brazil they found that that what happened is that they just put pretend women on the ballot, or they just took women's names and put them on the ballot, and then they said, oh, they got sick, and so I'm going to take her place. Anyway, it's not always successful, this idea of quotas. So that's what JPAL does. And so what we have found, we just did this last year, and in the menstrual change, we found that in the, I have this here. Okay, follow-up data shows that in the schools where the workshops were held, girls who had started their periods were absent 5% less during the following term than the year before. Okay, but it also, our study says, the lack of access to reproductive health education is not the only factor affecting girls' attendance and performance. Conditions in rural Kenya, like distance to schools, lack of public transportation, deficient access to adequate nutrition, normalization of sexual violence, teenage pregnancies, weather conditions, and cultural beliefs about the roles of girls in society are some of the many barriers Kenya must still overcome to accelerate educational inclusion. So we don't, you know, God, there's too much. What I could go on at length about this, maybe I shouldn't go on. Anyway, there's also more JPAL evidence that the real factors that contribute to girls staying in school is not lack of shame about menstruation or education about reproductive capacity, but the promise of better long-term income, well-being, and such like that. I think it's really hard to go based on the JPAL studies to figure out what's happening in this rural area of Kenya, because I think as it's evidence, there's so many, many, many different factors that are causing girls to leave school. Okay, so that was the JPAL question. On the question of, there was another
procedural versus outcome.
Oh, procedural versus. So, yeah, I mean, maybe this comes back to the issue of, yeah, so you give girls menstrual products who didn't have them before, that's good, but don't we want to have more outcome-based evaluations of what's just? And yeah, I'd like to do that. I'd like to have everybody, you know, have full capabilities, no question about it. Because I'm more of a capabilities approach than a kind of either procedural or mere outcome distribution approach. I don't think that those are adequate. But you got to start on the ground where you are and enhance people's capabilities, and that's what I think. I mean, yes, others can work for greater outcomes and others can work for more procedural processes, but my worry is that when we're talking about a capabilities approach and people aren't even up to a basic tolerable form of life, then that's a place to go. Now, I do think that also people who are to a tolerable point, we still have a long way to go. So here's a slide that I didn't include. I passed over. This is the Laszlo hierarchy of needs. Physiological needs, food, water, warmth, rest, safety needs, security and safety, belongings and love needs, intimate relationships and friends, esteem needs, prestige and feeling of accomplishment, self-actualization, achieving one's full potential, including creative activities. And so I actually think that just distributing stuff to people or even just money to people is not necessarily a way to enable them to flourish. And that what we've got to do is look more at self-actualization, achieving one's potential, including creative activities, a capability approach. So the question is, how do we move forward there? And after all these others are going to be met, safety, security, and belonging, and all of like that. But I think even where we're talking about people who have intimate relationships and friends and feelings of accomplishment, that the process of creating and using design to change the circumstances of your life are a way to gain greater fulfillment and meaning in your life. And I think personally, that's more important than stuff.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions, and so let's keep the questions shorter and the answers.
There weren't as many people when I first started.
Yeah, don't worry. Yeah. We'll manage, and maybe we can take two questions at the same time. So we'll start over there.
Thank you. I find it really interesting how you told about the co-design approach, and also very inspired by the experience you told us. So I just want to ask if you could clarify, what is the role you can bring into those approaches, especially as a person coming from the global north. And I believe when you go to Kenya or Colombia, there are big divergences in the local experience. So how can you bridge that? And also just want to ask, because as a philosopher and a social theorist, also as an experienced community organizer, how does this kind of expertise in your fields can you bring to the local communities?
Thank you. Let's take another question from the right. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I do have a question on the concept of incremental changes. I totally agree with the significance of those changes, but then if I have to measure what is more important, between radical change and incremental change. I would say the former one has more significance because you just brought up one example of sexual harassment law, for example, and this is actually the outcome of radical movements of, for example, defining what sexual harassment is and so on. And and also given the, I do believe there are two problems in terms of social change, the difficulty to bring the social change into the place. On the one hand, we do not have awareness, enough awareness. I think all of us, most of us, if not all of us, agree with that there are problems in capitalism. And capitalism is sort of the fundamental problem that, I don't know, well, I will just go quick on it. But there are a bunch of other people out there who are not aware of this fact. And they believe capitalism is just a thing that we need to keep. And and also on the other hand, we do have a feeling of powerlessness because given the urgency of climate change, for example, we do feel like really helpless and powerless because we know that the structural macro level change is necessary for the actual better outcome. So my question is, what's your account on this the relation between radical change and incremental change?
Thank you. So on the first question, yeah, there are lots of challenges in bridging differences. And what we do is we work with a local organization that has already started to identify some of the issues. So the Alliance for Responsible Mining was the one in Colombia. The Society Empowerment Project is the one in Kenya. And we don't dive down from 30,000 feet into a community and say, oh, we're going to do this here. What we do is we partner with organizations on the ground. And so our teams never are the ones to do the trainings and do the workshops. What we do is we work with the local organization who will then, help with us sort of construct the workshop, and they will have a better sense of what's going to be meaningful to the people on the ground, and they will speak the native language fluently and such like this. So I think one of the ways of doing the bridging is by identifying organizations that are already embedded in the community. And as a philosopher, what do I bringing? I think my experience in working with development people is that they have a lot of insight from their experience, but they don't have a way to sort of really articulate, say, the value of situated knowledge. And they don't have the way to think about a capabilities approach as opposed to a Rawlsian approach, right? They're very, they're incredibly insightful, and what they're doing is, I think, an embodied practice, and they've developed these incredible skills, but they don't have the kind of normative epistemology or normative social theory or political theory to sort of think through, what are we trying to accomplish here? At least the development specialists that I work with. And so I think what we do is we work together, for me, to try and articulate in terms that are philosophically meaningful what can justify some of the practices that they're engaged in, and they can teach me about how to be more effective and how to sort of see my values being implemented in a way that hopefully brings about change. So that's the philosophical. On the issue of incremental versus radical, I think there's a difference between what you intend and what you accomplish. I don't think that sexual harassment law, yeah, it came out of Catherine McKinnon. I've worked a lot on Catherine McKinnon. I know her, and she's a radical thinker. I don't think sexual harassment law was a radical intervention. I think it was an incredibly important and valuable intervention, and it went along with many other things that she was trying to do. But I think of it as incremental. And so, yeah, I think a radical intention to overthrow capitalism and overthrow patriarchy and all of this. This is great, you know, all power to you. But good luck with it, right? I want to see how you're going to do it. And what I'm trying to think about is how you do it in situations on the ground without being paternalistic and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And how to do consciousness raising in a way that is, you could do it with your class at Humboldt, right? The story of self. You know, it's not that you have to do it with poor girls in Kenya who don't have menstrual products. I mean, this is about methodologies for consciousness raising, and consciousness raising is going to be an incredible part of any social movement. And if you can't do that, if you can't get that off the ground, I think that that's going to be really hard to overthrow capitalism, just saying. So I think that yes, we can have radical intentions, but radical intentions are not good enough. And I think in terms of movements and incremental movements, I am not absolutely confident what a revolution is going to look like that will take down capitalism. And I'm not sure who's going to suffer under those conditions, because I don't think it's the richest people who are going to suffer. And so I think we have to take very seriously the fact that those who are already suffering and already marginalized, they're very vulnerable. And I'm not sure what revolution looks like unless it's a kind of a building up through incremental organizing to something that is really sustainable and large. And then there could be a revolution. I don't know what that's going to look like, but until we've got the empowerment of the people who are most vulnerable, I'm really wary, just saying.
Okay, so we will take a few more questions. Keep them short if you want to hear the answer, and then we have to slowly wrap it up, and we'll start with you here.
My questions concerns your notion of ideology, because I was a little confused. On the one hand, you said that ideology is culture, technique gone wrong. At the same time, sometimes I had the feeling that it was the same, almost synonymous, your use of ideology and culture, technique. So to quote you, you said that ideology can block imagination and a sense of possibility. And then you said, on the other hand, that culture is open-ended and always evolving. Organizing can disrupt ideology. So for you, it's like it seemed that ideology is only something negative and forever will be something negative, and that it's always going to be top-down and not bottom-up. But at the same time, I cannot imagine like a world without ideology. Can't there also be a counter-ideology? Doesn't there have to be a counter-ideology? Because in my life, like the only people who claim to not have any ideology are either my neoliberal or my right-wing relatives. So I don't, yeah. So that's my question, you know, like, is there a world without ideology? I cannot imagine it, because it's only the neoliberals who claim that.
Thank you. And the next person, and then?
I feel guilty because we had more time to like shorten our thoughts. Okay. How do you approach and negotiate making academic philosophical language and theory, like we've heard tonight, semiotics, epistemology, all of this, more accessible to when you encounter people who might not understand it without yourself falling into the trap of infantilizing what they might understand? And I understand that this is kind of what your strategy is about, but do you see your strategies of creating these stories and situated knowledge as a translation of the academic language? Or, yeah, I guess, how do you negotiate that, and how, when, and to what extent do you introduce the ideas that these theories that your own ideas are coming from, if it's not where they're coming from? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, and
Hi, thank you. I'm from the Global South, the so-called Global South, and I really believe that those initiatives that you mentioned that are in the frame of these development strategies can be developed intuitively by the communities without the intervention of the Global North. And I think that if this is too high for me, but if this is not happening, maybe it's due to the interactions between the global north and the global south, namely extractivism, extractivism, colonialism, and other interactions. So I just wanted to know, what do you think is the role of the global north on the global south, that's how it's called, and yeah, just your views in this in general. Thank you.
Thank you.
So ideology is used in different ways, and I used to use it in a generic way, coming from America, because I think that's the way it tends to be used in the United States, but I became a critical theorist, and I think that one of the important roles for the term ideology is to think about how individuals are interpolated into or subjectivized into a form of life, and a form of life that they then take up, even though it is not good for them or those around them. And so I've chosen to use the term ideology in a critical sense, and I use the term cultural techne for the more generic sense. So an ideology is a cultural technique gone wrong. So if you want to use the neutral term, I would say use cultural techne or your equivalent. I happen to be in a tradition that uses ideology in the pejorative or critical sense. I think it's a terminological difference, but a terminological difference that matters, because I think if you just think, oh, well, it's all the same, ideology, 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 then you don't have as good tools to distinguish the form of life that we're living that is empowering and, positive for developing human capability, and the ones that aren't. And so I prefer to use it in this way. In terms of trying to think about academic language on the ground, so I don't impose, I use it with my students, I use it when we're going through training, and I will talk with our partners on the ground about many of these things, and we talk about ideology and we talk about these sorts of things, but I let them try to decide what language to use in the community, in the workshops, right? And it depends on what's going. I know Libby, for example, in working with the gold miners, she's very, she uses a lot of academic language, and they learn a lot, and they start doing systems thinking, and they do all of this. But with high school girls in Kenya, we don't. It's going to be very context specific how we do that. And on how it's certainly, people can develop these methods intuitively, all power to them. I'm not denying that. Nothing I said denies that. I know of some communities where they haven't done it. And we have money, we have resources, we have engineers in the program who can help think about engineering biomass stoves and charcoal briquettes made out of agricultural waste. And the people we're working with are really happy to have support from engineers. There is such a thing as engineers without borders. It's like doctors without borders. If you want to say, oh yeah, well, we could have our surgeons figure it out, we just haven't figured that out yet, and we're going to have people die while we educate our surgeons to be able to do surgery in non-sterile environments. Well, fine, go ahead. But, it's good to have people with expertise who can come in and work with people who need the expertise and train the people who need the expertise. So yes, we have engineers who are happy to work with oil drums and bicycles and clay pots and things like this with the people to teach them how to design something that they can make and will solve their problems. And if they can figure it out for themselves, I'm happy to let them figure it out for themselves. But not everybody can. And to say, oh, they can't figure it out because capitalism or because the global north's post-colonial influence. Yep, that's true. That's true. It's all true. But I'm sorry, right now, it is our responsibility to try and make up for some of the damage that we've done. And people can say, I don't want to do it, fine, but I'm committed to doing it. I'm committed to taking responsibility for that damage and doing something that will bring the skills and the opportunities to people who need it and want it, for God's sakes. I mean, the people that we're working with really want the help.
I think this is a good transition to tomorrow's lecture, which has the title, Who Cares? Networks of Knowledge and Solidarity. I'm sorry that not all the questions could be asked, but we're running out of time. Thank you so much, Sally, for the lecture and the discussion, and hope to see you all tomorrow.